Hi everyone, it's Rachel back with the Shades of Orange, and today I'm here to do my top 10 favorite horror books of all time, or at least my favorite books as of 2020. Now, I wanted to do this video for a while, but I held off because I always worry about being too repetitive. I think it's really easy for booktubers to talk about their favorite books over and over again, so I am mindful of that when I do make channel content. But I thought a lot of you would be interested in this, and for selfish reasons, I also wanted to do this rankings video because I personally find it really interesting to look back at my older videos and see how my tastes have changed. So what I'd like to do is film this video now, and then maybe every 4 or 5 years come back and refilm a video like this and see how my tastes have changed, which books stay on the list and which ones move around, which new favorites get other books bumped off, and so forth. A lot of other booktubers have done these kind of lists, and I'm kind of a creep and I enjoy really watching their old videos and seeing how their tastes have changed, so I want to do this for myself. Now, before we get started, I want to mention a few things. First, I have put some restrictions on this just to make it a little bit easier because it was really hard to still choose. But I excluded graphic novels, novellas, short story collections, anthologies, etc. There's no nonfiction on this list. So these are proper full-length horror novels. And I didn't purposely restrict from putting young adult books on this list, but I actually ended up with 10 adult books. It's just the way that my list ended up, so that was interesting. And as well, I want to mention that I'm purposely not including any books that I read in 2020 because I don't want to give away my end of the year videos. I personally like leaving a little bit of a surprise, and so I'm only including books that I read prior to 2020 on this list. And again, when I redo this, you'll be able to see which of my current favorites moved around based off of my reading. All that being said, let's get into the actual books. First, at number 10, we have The Winter People by Jennifer McMahon. And this is a historical horror novel that's told over 2 timelines. It takes place in a remote cabin in a house that is set out in the wilderness and is surrounded by woods. This story takes place in the winter time, hence the title, and it's perfect to read during the winter months because of that. The current timeline follows 2 young sisters that are looking for their mother that has disappeared. And then there is an older timeline set, I think, about a century ago, and follows a couple that have infertility issues. It took them years and years to finally get pregnant, and they were able to have a child. However, the story starts with a terrible accident happening, and they are distraught. And so this story follows them trying to bring their daughter back to life, and they do it in a really unique way. This is not a zombie story, but it's absolutely creepy. And I really love this when I read it. This book would honestly be even higher up on this list if it wasn't told in 2 timelines, because while I like the present day story, I love the older story. Normally, I'm not someone who reads a lot of historical fiction, but the story set back a century ago was just absolutely creepy in a very quiet, unsettling way. This is very quiet horror and not the jump out of the closet kind, but I was gripped in and very much emotionally pulled into the story because of someone who had a lot of infertility issues themselves. Their story and their grief really hit home for me, so I definitely recommend this one, and I don't see enough people talking about it online. Again, go in not expecting a full-on horror story, but something a little more subtle. But for me, I found this one very creepy and would definitely consider it among my favorites. Next is one of the newer favorites on this list, and that is Imaginary Friend by Stephen Chbosky. And this is a story of a mother and her young son that are escaping an abusive relationship. They head off to a new town to start a new life. When they get there, they are struggling because they are trying to make ends meet. They are quite poor, and the boy is also struggling in school because he has dyslexia. At the very beginning of the story, he disappears and is not found for several days. When he does show up again, however, he is changed and seems to be quite different. He does better in school because he no longer seems to be dyslexic, but more so, he also starts to hear a voice that is whispering in his ear a possible imaginary friend or maybe something else that is telling him to do things. Now, this is what I describe as epic horror. It's quite long, but I flew through it and just fell in love with the story. It's told over multiple perspectives. You also get to hear from a girl, and you get to see these other perspectives. And of course, as you would expect, they eventually begin to come together and you see how everything fits. What I love so much about this book is that it felt like a puzzle. You get all of these clues. There are numbers and letters and just sections of the story that you feel are important, but you don't know why. And there's other sections that don't seem important at all. But then later in the book, you will have situations where you will realize that something mentioned hundreds of pages ago was actually important and comes up again. And I love when stories connect like this. So this is one that I got completely immersed in. I remember resenting having to take care of my son, resenting having to make supper because all I wanted to do was read this. And I probably sound like a bad mother, but that tells you just how much I got just immersed in the story and found it absolutely gripping. Now, if the ending of this book had been better, it absolutely would have ended up higher up on this list because I loved everything else about this book. But for such an amazing buildup, this book kind of struggled at the end, and I do think that that is a problem in horror in general. And the fact that this book made my list despite the ending being so imperfect really says a lot about everything else in this book that makes me love it so much. So go in with an open mind. Keep in mind that it's not a perfect book, but man, do I love it. And I just can't wait to reread it at some point. Then at number 8, we have Beneath by Christy DeMeester. And this is a story set in the South that follows a journalist that goes back to her hometown to investigate a snake handling church. And within the story, you follow a young girl that is about to be initiated into the church, but instead she is bitten and things go wrong. And this book is good for so many reasons. Definitely has that creepy snake aspect to it. So if you are someone that has a fear of snakes, this book will be very scary. There were definitely some very creepy scenes with some slithering snakes. I don't personally have a phobia of them, but I still found those scenes to be very, very unsettling and kind of gave me goosebumps, and I could almost feel something moving on me. So on that level, I definitely recommend this book. But this book also has a lot of things that appeal to me on different levels, something that I really look for in books, because I often compare Christy DeMeester to being one of the closest writers in my mind to Gillian Flynn, one of my favorite thriller writers. And I like her stories because she really goes for unlikable characters. And she truly writes some despicable people in this book. One of the perspectives is the preacher of the snake handling church. And he has some pretty impure thoughts about this young girl. And there is some definite uncomfortable subject matter in here, and she does not shy away from that. So definitely some content warnings, but she really pushes the envelope and writes these really great characters because this man is very despicable, but at the same time you see the other parts of his personality and you see him playing a role in the story, and it just makes your feelings very, very complicated and you feel very, very uncomfortable reading it. Another thing that I love so much about this book is the mother and daughter relationships. You can tell that this was a major theme when she was writing the book, and I really like the fact that it doesn't play out the perfect mother, but rather a very imperfect one. And I just think it's really important that these narratives exist, because whether we read this book as a daughter or as a mother ourselves, I think society and fiction tends to really idolize the role of motherhood. And just because you have given birth to a child does not mean that you are a perfect person by any means. And I think that this book just is fierce and dark and again just uncomfortable in all the best ways. So it's one I don't see talked about enough online, and I would definitely recommend it to all of you. Then at number 7, we have The Nightmare Room by Chris Sorensen, which is the first book in a trilogy called The Messy Man. And if you've been watching my channel for a while, you've probably heard me say that I don't really like haunted house stories. So the fact that there is a haunted house book on this list says a lot about it. And this is one of the first times that I really connected with a haunted house narrative. And I think it's because Chris Sorensen does it right. Now, this book follows a couple that have recently lost their young son. They are now moving back to the father's hometown because his own father is sick and moving into a nursing home. They move in specifically to a very old and decrepit house. The man is an audiobook narrator, so he sets up the basement as an audiobook studio. And I like to mention this because the author himself is an audiobook narrator, and so I think he brings a lot of his own experience into the story. Now, as you would expect from a story like this, the house is a little bit creepy, strange things start to happen, and with the audiobook angle, you get a bit of a audio experience. I did read the physical book, but you start to find strange things showing up on the man's recordings and strange things happening in the basement, and you just start to wonder if there is a presence in the house. Now, what Chris Sorensen does so well in this book is he makes you really care about these characters. There is so much emotional baggage in this story in the best possible way, and I just found myself pulling for the characters and very much invested that way. So at the same time, there definitely was some creepy things going on, and that did work for me on a level. But in a lot of ways, this is a tragic story about family and grief and loss and so many good things, and the start of a very strong trilogy. And I am just so happy that I gave this book a try, because I typically say no to haunted house stories when they are offered to me. But I gave this book a chance, and here it is among my favorites. Now at number 6, we actually have a horror classic, which I don't tend to love, but this one definitely was the exception, and that of course is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. This is a story of the lone survivor of a pandemic that caused everyone to turn into zombie-like vampires. Now this man believes he is the last survivor and is holed up in his house and just trying to survive as long as possible. Now, I love this book for so many reasons, but I became really attached to the main character and really identified with him. He is a very illogical man, and so despite having these creatures clawing at his door that certainly seem like vampires because they are turned off by mirrors and garlic and crucifixes and all the things that the stories tell you that are vampire lore, he ends up still questioning whether or not they're truly vampires and goes on to do different scientific experiments to try to figure out what is actually going on. And as a huge skeptic, that really appealed to me, because I feel like I'm the only other person in the world that would have vampires clawing at my door, and I would still be questioning and thinking, well, maybe it's something else. And I just found this book to be grim and depressing, which isn't normally things that I would describe about my favorite books, but I just got so immersed in the story and just absolutely gripped by the narrative. And it's definitely a quieter one. There isn't a lot of action as you would expect with kind of one man in a cabin surrounded by creatures, but I was just pulled into the story and I had no idea where it was going. It had such a good ending, which is something I don't always get to say about horror books. And I just thought this one just was such a gut punch of a story, and I loved it so much. So definitely recommend it. Even if you're someone who doesn't think that you like older stories, this is a horror classic that really stands up today. Now, getting into my top 5, we have Pet Sematary by Stephen King. This, of course, is a story of a family that move into a new place, and they find out that there is a graveyard nearby where people bury their pets. I don't want to say more than that, just in case you have not heard this story before, because it's definitely one to experience for yourself. This is the only Stephen King book that is going to show up on this list. I didn't restrict myself in terms of featuring an author more than once, but of all of his work, this is my favorite and the only one that made my top 10, but I absolutely love it. This story just pulled me in. This, again, is one of those stories that is very much focused around a family and is very emotionally heavy. And I just love this story so much. At the same time, it's really creepy. And again, is one of those horror stories that has a really good ending. I would say this is in my top 5 favorite horror books in terms of endings. I just thought it was so good. And it's one that I have reread the ending just to experience it again. And so if you haven't read Stephen King before, I would definitely recommend starting here. And especially for those of you like me that can be a little bit hit or miss with him as an author, if you haven't tried this one, check it out. I personally consider it to be his best, and it's definitely worth reading. A true horror book. And yeah, what else can I say? I'm just gushing at this point. Now at number 4, this might actually surprise you, and that is I'm Thinking of Ending Things by Ian Reid. This is a story of a couple that are going on a road trip to meet the boy's parents, and the girl who is traveling with him is thinking about ending the relationship. This is one of those books you want to go into without knowing too much. And so I'm going to leave the synopsis there. But the reason that I say you might be surprised it's not higher up on my list is that I often describe this book as my all-time favorite book. However, and this is kind of where things get weird in Rachel's head, but while I consider this to be my all-time favorite book, I don't necessarily consider it to be my favorite horror book, and that's the fact that I almost don't consider this book to be horror. I've seen so many other people put this in their horror recommendations videos. They describe it as a horror book, but for myself, I definitely think of this book first and foremost as a literary story, and if anything, it's more suspenseful in my mind. So it's almost a book that I almost didn't include on this list because I don't think of it when I think of horror, but is it one of my favorites? Yes, so I decided to include it here. And this book is very creepy. It's set primarily on the road in the winter months, and they are driving through a snowstorm, and so it has an incredible atmosphere. And as someone who lives in Canada and has done many a road trip at night in the snow, I definitely related to that experience. It was a very creepy book. It'd be wonderful to read on audio if you're ever going on a road trip yourself. And I love this book because the writing is so sharp and it's just unsettling because you don't know where it's going, you don't know what's happening. And I just find myself just getting lost in his prose, getting lost in this story. And it's a book that I will revisit and reread over and over again because if you've read this story, you know what I mean, that as soon as you finish it, you will want to go back to the very beginning and start it all again. And that was definitely my experience with it. It was my experience when I reread it this year, and I just adore this book. So a bit of an unconventional pick. I don't consider this to be a very classic take on the horror genre, but in terms of a good book, in terms of an unsettling book, this one is fantastic. And as you can guess, because of where I put it on my list at number 4, I would definitely recommend it. Now at number 3, we have Horns by Joe Hill. And this is a book I actually haven't talked about on my channel in a really long time. This is a book about a young man whose girlfriend has died. She has been murdered, and most of the town people suspect him of killing her. One day he wakes up and starts to find horns growing out of his head. And at the same time, with this strange new thing happening to him, he finds that he has the ability to hear people's thoughts, or specifically their sinful thoughts. And from there, he goes around and starts to hear the dark things that the people around him are thinking. This is the book that feels very fantastical in a very dark way, of course, and I love it for so many reasons. It's a bit humorous in a way because you really get to hear the things that people think that they don't necessarily say, and so it felt very indulgent reading it, getting to hear all of these dirty thoughts and, again, things that people would never say in a million years out loud, but are probably thinking, which is very disturbing when you think about it. And at the same time, this book definitely hits on a lot of the themes that I personally love to see in horror. It has a bit of that religious angle because of the focus on sins, a bit of an angle of demonic possession perhaps, and it just ties in a lot of the things that I find really scary and fun in the genre. I wouldn't actually call this book scary per se, but it has the elements that I love to see in this genre. And to my memory, this is one of the first adult horror books that I really found myself enjoying and made me think that the horror genre was for me. Before then, I'd read a couple, but they just missed the mark. And I used to say that I wasn't a horror reader, which is crazy to say now. But this book just was funny and dark, and I loved everything about it. I thought it was a very gripping story, and I do think that Joe Hill does a really good job bringing in some fantastical elements. So if you kind of like a bit of magical, supernatural things happening in your books. You'll definitely get that from him. And I just adore this one. I definitely need to reread it because of the books I'm ranking on this list here. This one is definitely a little bit faded in my memory, and it does make it hard to compare it to books that I read quite recently. So I believe it goes in the number 3 spot. In some ways, I almost want to put it higher, but again, I need to reread it and see how it actually compares to the other horror books I have picked up in the years since then. Now at number 2, we have The Cabin at the End of the World by Paul Tremblay, which is the story of a gay couple that take their adopted daughter to go and vacation in their cabin in the woods. However, a group of strangers show up, force themselves into the house, and make them make an impossible choice. And I'm going to leave the synopsis there, but say that this book to me was incredibly suspenseful. And the reason for that is that, in my opinion, Paul Tremblay is a master of writing characters. I became so attached to both of these gay men as well as their young daughter, and I cared very deeply for their safety. I wanted to make sure they were all going to be okay. And I just found this situation to be very unsettling, very uncertain. And I would describe this book as very claustrophobic and stressful to read because I really didn't know what was going to happen. I think that Paul Tremblay is one of the best writers in the genre. He has a bit of a literary quality to his work where he takes different subgenres, but he really goes to some different places. And in a lot of ways, this book is about so much more than the home invasion. Instead, this is a story about love and family. And I just loved how he played with all of those themes. And I thought the book was absolutely beautiful. If you've read Paul Tremblay before, you know a lot of the things about his books that make them so unique. And I don't want to spoil anything here, but if you are a fan of his work and have somehow not read this one, you have to check it out. It's not for everyone, but it was absolutely for me, and I just cannot stop gushing about this one. And finally, we are at the number 1 spot. Can you guess it? Do you know what book is missing? That, of course, is A Nosferatu by Joe Hill. This is the only author that is featured twice in this video, but I couldn't help but include both of my favorites here. This, of course, is the story of a young girl named Vic McQueen that has this uncanny ability to drive across this imaginary bridge on her bike and find missing things. She ends up getting tangled up with an evil man named Charlie Manx that steals away children and takes them to Christmas Land. I adore this book. I have reread it pretty much every single Christmas since I first read it, and I love it even more each time. This is pretty crazy to say, but the first time I read this book, I only gave it 3.5 stars, and my initial review said that it was too long, and it kills me that that was my initial impression. I like this book, but it's definitely one that I've come to appreciate and love more and more as I have reread it. This is a book that I always read on audio because the narrator, Kate Mulgrew, does an amazing performance. She puts on the creepiest voices, and it is just such a great experience. This book is one that when I reread it, I realize that every single page, every single chapter is necessary and wonderful and adds to the story. So I no longer think it's too long. Instead, it's just the perfect length, and I just soak up the story every time. And this is just such a brilliant story. It has one of the best villains I have ever read in a horror novel. Charlie Manx is so darn creepy, and the children are creepy, and there is just so many layers to this book. I think this book is legitimately scary, but at the same time, it brings in a lot of the humor I love, a lot of those dark, fantastical elements that really jive well with me. And I just cannot recommend this book enough. I do think you can read it at any time of the year, not just Christmas. It's actually set primarily in the summer. If you are a fan of the genre and have somehow never read this book, please change that. I cannot stop gushing about this one. I think it's a pretty popular one, but it's for a reason, and at the moment, this is definitely my number 1 favorite horror book. I am obsessed with it. So that is it for this video. I would love to hear from all of you in the comment sections with your reactions and opinions. And especially, I would love to hear what are your top 10 favorite horror books. We can compare and see how our tastes shake up. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. I do read a lot of horrors, you can probably tell from this video, but I also read some thrillers, science fiction, and fantasy. If you haven't yet subscribed, please consider doing so. And if you are already subscribed, you can help me out by liking this video, hitting that notification bell, and also sharing this online. I would be so honored if you would tweet about this or share it on Reddit, because it was a lot of fun to put this video together and I'm pretty proud of it. So thank you all. I will talk to you again soon. Okay, bye-bye.